Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to this latest online event, Remembering and Forgetting Partition in Ireland with Professor Guy Beiner. Can I remind everyone to ensure that your devices are muted throughout the session? If you have any issues, technical or otherwise, during the event, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen and you can message me directly. I can see some people doing that already, asking me questions, and I will get to those answers in just a moment. If you have any questions for Guy during the event, please also direct those through the chat function to me, and I will pick those up at the end and pitch them if we have time, and we're hoping to have time to do that. What we don't want is everyone shouting over the top of each other because it's just not going to work. My name is Jason Burke. I've been coordinating the Linen Hall Library's centenary activities to mark the creation of Northern Ireland and the partition of Ireland in 1921. And today, as you can see, I'm joining you live from the library's governor's room, surrounded here by some of our unique and prized collections. The Linen Hall Library is a truly unique institution. Founded in 1788, it is the oldest library in Belfast and the only remaining library in Ireland that still generates a proportion of its income from membership. And for more information on how to become a member, you can visit our website at www.linenhall.com. The library is also supported by various funders which help us maintain our various activities throughout the year. This particular event is part of the Linen Hall's Ireland Divided programme, of which we are about halfway through at this point. The project has been funded through the Shared History Fund, which the National Lottery Heritage Fund is distributing on behalf of the Northern Ireland office to help groups mark the Centenary of Northern Ireland. And I want to place on record our thanks to the funders for making all of this possible. I first encountered Professor Guy Beiner back in 2015 at the Ulster Museum in Belfast. I somehow found myself on a panel of experts for a History Ireland Head School talking about remembering and forgetting 1916 in front of what was quite a big audience. Coincidentally, the host, Tommy Graham, sat me right next to Guy on the panel. And as the event progressed, I was coming to terms with the fact that this was simultaneously the best and the worst seat for me to have. Worst because trying to sound intelligent beside Guy was almost impossible for me. And best because, quite simply, he's the best historian that I've had the pleasure to see at work. For that reason, I think it's no exaggeration to say that the Linen Hall Library is extremely privileged to have Professor Guy Beiner as part of our Ireland Divided programme. And you, the audience, are extremely privileged to be able to hear from one of the best in the business. Guy Beiner is currently the Sullivan Professor of Irish Studies at Boston College and Professor of Modern History at the Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. And it's my pleasure to hand over to him now as he talks to us about remembering and forgetting partition in Ireland.
Hi, thank you very much, and thank you all for attending. I think there's a voice there in the background. And in a way, thanks for setting me up here, Jason. I should say in advance, I specialize in the study of remembering and forgetting in modern history, but I am by no way a specialist on matters of partition. And I want to say that in advance. I want to be very clear about it in advance. In a way, when Jason approached me to give this talk, I thought of declining at first because of that. And actually, I'm thankful to Jason. I think the Linen Hall Library is very fortunate to have somebody so knowledgeable with such an astute sense of history as its programming officer, as Jason, and the wonderful work that he does. And I'd like to thank him actually for pushing me out of my comfort zone and to kind of engage with a topic which I haven't properly perhaps engaged with in the past. And that's good, I think, because I think engaging with partition is a discomforting topic in itself. You have to be uncomfortable when you engage with partition. And that's a point that I'll make towards the end of the talk and explain what I mean by that. So here it is. I'm going to start engaging with something which is new for me here. The slide that you see in the background there, just to set the scene, is a fairly recent mural. I understand that Jason lives not too far away from it in East Belfast. A loyalist mural commemorating or marking this 100 years of Northern Ireland and of partition. And on the other hand, a fairly recently founded Republican socialist group, which is protesting the commemoration of partition. So we see two different images just to kind of set the scene. Now, when I came to look at this myself, I thought it would be interesting, first of all, for me, and I'd share that with you as well, to kind of survey the historiography of partition. It's a major topic, perhaps the major topic in many ways of 20th century, maybe of modern Irish history, a modern history of the British Isles in many ways. And this is quite interesting when you look at the historiography, because not that much was written for many years on the specific topic of partition. And this is already how we begin to feel this notion of it being an uncomfortable topic, a topic which in many ways was neglected academically. Just to give an example, here's one example. This would be Chart. David Alfred Chart. For those who don't know, he was a civil servant, and he became the deputy keeper of PreMemory, of the archives in Belfast. He was the first deputy keeper from 1924 to 1948. He managed the archives. Now, partition affected his own life. He moved from Dublin to Belfast. It affected the archive. It set up the archive that he worked in. And when he came to write a history of Northern Ireland, it's a wee book. It's not that long a book. When he came to write it, you would have thought that partition would be heavy. He's writing in 1927 a history of Northern Ireland. I mean, this event looms heavy in the background, but he only deals with it in a few sentences. And he says very clearly, he doesn't want to, he says, without reopening recent controversies and recalling many painful memories. So he's kind of flagging, this is an uncomfortable topic. I don't want to deal with it. I'll deal with it very briefly and move on. And that, in a way, is just an example of this kind of official reluctance, of a unionist reluctance to deal with partition. Now, people did write quite a bit about partition, but when you look at the books that are coming out in partition in the early years, and even afterwards, most of what is being written, I would label as, just move the slide here, as nationalist polemics. Here's an example of a Northern writer, Henry Harrison. For those who don't know, Henry Harrison was he's from County Down, landowner background, Protestant, Presbyterian, in fact, the family. It's an interesting family, and he's a nationalist. He was a Parnellite in the late 19th century, in many ways was the last Parnellite, even more than John Redmond. He stays kind of loyal to the ideas of Parnell for many, many years after Parnell dies, and ultimately ends as being a supporter of Fianna Fáil and Eamon de Valera. He's the editor of the Irish News for a while. And when he writes this booklet on the partition of Ireland, it's very clear that he opposes partition. It's a blot on the record of British statesmanship. It's full of evils and anomalies and inconsistencies. It's all about divide and rule. And that is a way of somebody kind of engaging with the history of partition, but we can see very well where it's coming from. And this would be the stance of many of the writers on partition. I'll give another example of a Republican background. Harrison wasn't quite Republican background. He comes from kind of nationalist constitutional background. This would be Frank Gallagher. Frank Gallagher was a journalist, an author, a Republican, also an editor of the Irish press, a Fianna Fáil supporter. Afterwards, he's a censor during World War II. And when he writes his book, The Story of Partition of Ireland, it's very clear to him that this is something which is wrong. It's an injustice which has to be moved away. And that's the whole way the book is phrased. It's a historical injustice. It's a blot. And his epilogue is about the partition was unnecessary. So, I mean, this is the angle of how it's approached historically. Not in terms of, I mean, the politics are there all the time. And you can also see it, by the way, in the imagery immediately. If we look at the person I mentioned before, Harrison, the map that he uses to illustrate his argument is this map, which is quite familiar map, but it's a map, of course, which is designed to show that partition is not viable. It's a map designed to show that if there should have been partition, it should have been a two-county partition. Anything else isn't viable as an injustice, is wrong, doesn't work. And it's quite interesting when you look at this map because it's recycled again and again in numerous publications, such as David O'Neill's booklet 1946, which is a Republican booklet against partition. But in all the literature, of course, there's a vibrant politics against partition where this map appears again and again. De Valera gives a talk with this map. It appears again and again, and other maps, which are very much in the same vein of anti-partition, which from the 40s and the 50s campaigns, which make a strong statement. So partition is often approached historically through nationalist polemics. So when does historiography, academic historiography proper begin of partition? That's quite interesting, quite late in a way. Maybe we could start with 1950 with Dennis Gwyn's book. Dennis Gwyn himself, from a journalist background, is the research professor of modern history at University College Cork. And he writes this book where he's very proud of saying this is the first proper study of partition in 1950. But when you read him, he's also quite clear. His politics are there. He writes about partition as harmful and illogical and cannot continue indefinitely. So this is, again, a nationalist kind of stance. So when do we move out of that? Well, a revisionist take on partition would be in the 1980s, a small booklet by Michael Laffan from University College Dublin. And much later, towards the end of the millennium, Thomas Hennessy, from those who don't know, as an historian whose background is in Belfast. He was at the University of Ulster, he was at the Queen's University of Belfast. Afterwards, he moved to Canterbury in England, and he wrote this very, very good book on World War I and partition, dividing Ireland. But when you look at it as a whole, this body of literature, for many years, the bibliography was fairly scant, scarce. And that says something. This major topic looming over 20th century history, and yet historians have a problem with it. Memory is not about history alone. I'm starting with history, we'll move beyond history shortly. But we can learn quite a lot from historiography in this case, because of course there's been a boom recently around the Centenary. And then there's all these titles which have come up in recent years, whether it's Peter Leary's very good book on unapproved routes, or these books on the border, which came out in 2016, Diarmaid Ferreter's book on the legacy of the border, Cormac Moore's book on the birth of the border. So there's a whole series of books on the border, the issue of the border, A Difficult Birth by Parkinson, The Early Years of Northern Ireland. All these books hover around partition and its effects. And then books which put partition in the title as major books. Robert Lynch's book, Charles Townsend's book, which just came out now, a small booklet by Ivan Given's, Partition, How and Why, and a book which is about to come out shortly, a collection of essays edited by Fleming and James H. Murphy, Ireland and Partition. And I'm sure there's much more. You know, there's many articles and other publications. So it's now burst as a major topic. We can't say there's any historiographical neglect at the moment. But what's interesting for me as a scholar interested in memory is when we look at this body of literature is how little it actually says about memory of partition. And this is interesting. We've got to put this in a wider perspective to actually appreciate it. And partition is a huge field in historical and interdisciplinary studies, just to kind of show what's happening around the world at the moment. So for example, this collection of essays by Ari Dubnov and Laura Robson, Partitions as a Transnational History of the 20th Century. So there'll be many other partitions which we can compare to and see how they influence each other. Or another book which hasn't quite made a mark yet, but is closer to what I'm speaking about now, a collection of essays on partitions and their afterlives. Violence, Memories and Living, has an article there by Harrington on partition in Ireland. But overall, what strikes me as remarkable is that people haven't written about the history of the memory of partition. Now, to explain why this is unusual, we can take an example. Let's look at India, another great partitions of the 20th century. A lot has been written about the partition of India and Pakistan, but fascinating for me, and this is just looking from the outside, but somebody interested in history of memory, the books that I've read in recent years, so many books have been written about memory of partition in India and in the Indian subcontinent, as in Pandey's book, Remembering Partition, about the violence of partition, or Dido's book about the literature of partition, or Saint's book about, again, that's also about the fiction writing about partition, or Menon's book about theatre and dramatic productions about partition, how it appears in Indian theatre, or a collection of essays written by Amritjit Singh and his colleagues on revisiting India's partition, about the memory and culture effects of it. And we can keep on going. Oral histories and the silence about partition and how it appears in oral histories is very interesting in Boutalia's book On the Other Side of Silence. Or if you want to look at the material culture and the memory of partition through material culture in Malholtra's book, or a very recent book published about oral histories in Britain of migrants, of immigration and partition, about people remember looking back on partition, Puri's book on partition voices, or Mann and Murphy's collection on partitions and the practice of memory, or another collection on memories and post-memories. Post-memories means what they refer to here is a term often used for second and third generation remembering partition. So the point I'm trying to make here is in India, this is a massive topic, people dealing with the legacy and the memory of partition. And in Ireland, that hasn't happened. And this, I think, is the predicament which I want to bring to your attention. And I think it's also an open challenge. It's an open challenge to historians, and not only to historians, to anybody, I think, but I think for interdisciplinary scholars, particularly those from the social sciences, and I'll comment on that as well, on the need to investigate this question of how we commemorate and also look at its legacy and how it's been commemorated in the past. So we're going to move to commemoration. And as I mentioned, I can see Dom Bryan is in the room, a great fan of historians' involvement in commemoration. Well, of course, there's other people, not only historians, who deal with commemoration. And here I'll comment on a very interesting comment made by two very interesting political scientists, John Evershed, who's now in University College Cork, and Rebecca Graff McGray in Canada. And they wrote an interesting blog piece of a larger project they're looking at of the politics of commemoration. And they asked, can partition and the Irish border be commemorated? Now, I know originally Jason built my talk as a talk about commemoration. Commemoration is just part of a larger picture. I don't just deal with commemoration, I want to deal with a larger issue of memory and forgetting and put commemoration into that. But what is striking is how this major event, which affects the island, and definitely affects Northern Ireland, the founding event of Northern Ireland, wasn't really commemorated throughout the 20th century, barely. And that's the point we need to think about. And an interesting point that Evershed and Graff McRae make is this event is so highly charged in politics. As we approach the centenary of partition, can it even be commemorated? And they ask a very basic question: what date do you choose? When you do a commemoration, you have to choose a date on which to hold the commemorations. And it's a huge question. There's many possible dates. When did commemoration happen? Was it in 2020 with the Government of Ireland Act? Was it when the Government of Ireland Act comes into effect? Is it with the opening of the Parliament? Is it when King George visits the Parliament, which is not its opening, but it's kind of this official opening? Is it later when the Northern Ireland Parliament decides to opt out of being part of the Irish Free State, which is just in December 1922, towards the very end? Or is it only with the Boundary Commission in 1925? There's so many different dates. Commemoration is a process, it's not even an event. And that's an interesting point. Now, interestingly enough, this point, and this kind of amuses me, seems to have been resolved. Now, I know Jason told me there was an event held at the Lennon Hall exactly with the people behind this. But I thought this notice is quite interesting. How this is a screenshot from BBC. How historians have declared the 3rd of May as Northern Ireland's birth date. I find this quite amusing that a panel of historians appointed by the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland, Boris Johnson, 8 historians, sits together, weighs these different dates, and decides that the appropriate date to mark commemoration is the 3rd of May. But it's interesting that a date has to be given a century later. For a whole century, we had to live in this kind of limbo of when partition happens. Everybody talks about it, but it's not precise. And then a panel has to weigh it and speak authoritatively. And of course, is that the way it's decided? Is that the way commemoration works? I think that says a lot in itself. And the result of a commemoration which is being determined and decided and I wouldn't say quite imposed, but being pushed by certain agents produces a certain result. And it's interesting in itself. And you people would be much more familiar than myself. I'm an outsider just observing it from the outside, almost in a very amateur fashion. So people in Belfast in the room would be far more knowledgeable than myself what's happening on the ground. But I think it's interesting, and here just to give an example from the Guardian coverage, but we could look at many other places. The way the commemorations on the 3rd of May that took place, it's interesting how it was described as low-key commemorations, how even the tributes from the Queen and from the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, were measured tributes, very carefully worded, how various signs of protest were shown around, where there's some flagging of the flag on the side and different points. But it's a half-hearted, heavily contested commemoration. And that is part of the picture, this unease about commemorating partition, which makes it a difficult subject. And I'd like to comment on that more generally. But I also like to talk about the challenge that it raises. I think it's important, and here I should pay correct tribute to Dominic Bryan, because before it was, of course, a joke, because he is the man who points out that commemoration is about, constantly points out, in fact, about how commemoration is about the past and the present, how social scientists are well positioned to explain the politics of what's happening now. And I think even without the politics of Brexit and the protocol which complicate things, commemoration is a highly contested event, commemoration of partition. And we need to explore and see what's happening around in terms of the ritual that's being introduced. But I think as an historian, this is where historians do have something to say. It was interesting to see Owen Purdue in the room here, who's a great historian of public history. I think there's a history to be written of remembering and forgetting partition in Northern Ireland. And I would even suggest that such a history would end up presenting an alternative history of Northern Ireland. It would be an interesting way to explore the history of Northern Ireland as an alternative history, kind of this history of remembering and forgetting how people approached partition as a key, as an index, a way of exploring the history of Northern Ireland. And I'll add another point. If anybody's read the work that I do on memory elsewhere, also in Ireland on different cases, one of the points that I like to make, which is slightly unusual perhaps, is where do we begin histories of memory and forgetting? I mean, it seems quite obvious, isn't it? We begin after the event. Partition happens, we wait a few years till its memory forms, and then we begin following its memory and how it's forgotten at the end of the line. This is not what happens at all when we deal with memory and history. One of the points I like to make as an historian of memory and history is that memory, history, and forgetting work in tandem all the time, from the very beginning. Even more so, a provocative point I like to make is that memory can precede history. And I'll illustrate this very quickly, very briefly. Considerations of how we remember an event happen even before the event actually happens. Let me explain how this great paradox happens. If we would write a history of remembering and forgetting partition, I would say that it would have to begin before 1920. Let me just give an illustration why. It's actually quite obvious to me. Let's look, for example, at this postcard from the collections of the Ulster Museum. This is a collection from around 1912, 1914. It's the third Home Rule crisis, right? And it's a map, which is produced as a postcard, a unionist map, which talks about the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ulster. Now, partition isn't on the table in 1912, 1914. What we have is mobilization in Ulster of Ulster Unionists against the Home Rule Bill. And at the moment, the debate is about opposing Home Rule opposing Home Rule across Ireland. And yet it's heavily mobilized and localized within Ulster. So we have this map here, which is a map of partition. Before partition is on the cards, before partition happens, there's already an imagination of partition. And this is spread globally. We can see it in popular culture in many ways. Let me give another interesting image across the Atlantic. I'm in the States at the moment, so let's give an example from the United States, from a satirical magazine, Puck. This appears in Puck in August 1914. It's a series of images which you might not be able to see too well here. I'd have to expand it, but I won't go into them. But it's a series of images called The Kidnappers, different issues which are being kidnapped and changed around in August 1914. As the world goes into World War I, politics seems to be changed everywhere. And the interesting image, actually, is this one over here. Roosevelt kidnapping the Republican Party. Teddy Roosevelt, had set up this populist party, progressive party, to take over the Republican Party. It doesn't quite work. They say you can reverse the page. Who is taking over who? So I thought this is current in a way, a Republican Party being kidnapped by a figure who sees himself as a populist, a very different figure, but it's interesting. But the image for us, which is interesting, is the image, let me just put a pen here, a laser pen, would be the image over here, which is actually a familiar image. This is Carson kidnapping Ulster from Home Rule Ireland. So again, it's notions of partition before partition. And the memory of partition has to be explored. It's kind of what I call pre-memory. And if we factor that into a history of remembering and forgetting partition, then I'll make a point here, and I'm just making it briefly. This is just something to think about. I haven't written a history of remembering and forgetting partition. This is a challenge to be done and to be picked up, I hope, by other scholars. But I would say it's interesting. I say there's this unionist pre-memory of partition, but there's also something that I call pre-forgetting. Even before the event happens, people don't want to contemplate it. It's awkward. And you can see that among nationalists, who of course refuse already from 1912, 1914 to contemplate such a possibility. And how it comes in and comes out, this anxiety about contemplating it will feed into these anxieties and awkwardness, which will follow the memory of partition afterwards throughout the century. And that's the key point, perhaps, that I'd like to make. I'm not going to sketch out a detailed history of the remembering and forgetting of partition. I think it's interesting to state that there hasn't been official commemoration, but that when we try to understand for many years why that happens of this founding event, which is a founding event for Northern Ireland, I think there's some points which are quite obvious in many ways. This is an awkward memory. It's an embarrassing memory. It's full of ambiguity. It's a contested memory. And this is from the outset and throughout. If we look, for example, at the visit of King George and the opening of the Parliament, which was in City Hall, of course, originally, before Stormont was founded, you know, there's huge celebrations. And this event seems to be the beginning of remembrance and public celebration and people getting together to mark partition. But of course, it's contested. And this is a picture of a demonstration in London from 1921. But of course, there's a large part of the population that feels uncomfortable about partition. So it's contested from the beginning. And I'll return to that later when I give general thoughts about this, because I'd like to actually make that more complicated. It's not as simple as it may sound. It seems obvious to us, but it's not. And this continues throughout. So of course, partition is repeatedly contested, and there's protests against partition by nationalists in recurring campaigns again and again. Here I'm taking pictures to jump way later into the 80s. This is a hunger strike march, which the theme of the hunger strike march is the end of partition from 1980 in London along the Thames embankment. But at the same time, let's think of 1985, the protests against the Anglo-Irish Treaty and the massive protests, which in a way are protests for the continuation of partition. So this topic is always there. It's contested, it's problematic. It's not a place that people think wrongly, perhaps, that commemoration is about people gathering together and marking something, and it brings people together in terms of solidarity. Anybody who knows anything about partition, and here I should perhaps defer to a fantastic scholar, Northern Irish scholar in Denmark, Aarhus, Laura McAtakney, who makes this point very brilliantly about how it's always contested. It's always about politics. And that makes a problem in the commemoration of partition and in the way it's publicly remembered or publicly forgotten. And I'll add to that, that partition is, of course, tied in with a history of violence and displacement. From the very beginning, from the sectarian violence in both communities around partition, if we put this in comparative scale, we could say it's small compared to places like India and Pakistan, or to Palestine, Israel, where I come from, in other partitions. And yet, the sectarian violence, the refugees that had to leave, this picture of refugees crossing over, Catholic refugees crossing over to Dublin, but violence that recurs again and again in relation to partition. Whether I'm giving an image here, this is just images to kind of remind us of different moments. It's a whole history into itself. But the IRA bombing campaign in the 1950s into the early 1960s, violence in terms of protesting partition, disrupting, trying to disrupt partition, but through violence. And of course, the eruption of the Troubles. In many ways, partition appears all the time in the background of the Troubles. So it's an awkward history also because it's a violent history, because it's an inconvenient history. Now, I've said all of these things, and I'm wondering perhaps now I should actually stop the share screen for a minute if I can. I've got a problem here with my screen. Let me just stop here for a minute. And perhaps I'll say some general things if I may. I don't have too much time left. And I thought it would be interesting if I could speak more generally about partition, because I'm short of time. I would have kept sketching out this picture. But what I'd like to talk about is two issues briefly. I'd like to talk about memory of partition, and I'd like to talk about partitioned memory. Two connected but different themes. And this is general kind of conclusions, if you wish, which you might want to think about. The first point is that I would say that partitions inevitably, all partitions, Northern Ireland is not an exception, it's just a specific case, are messy affairs. They leave a lot of people on all sides unsatisfied. It's not simply about winners and losers. And it leaves people unsatisfied because already at the moment of partition, there's always people left on the wrong side of the border. This is true in Northern Ireland for Catholics and Protestants. People were left outside of the unit they prefer to be in, right? So there's Catholics who might have wanted to be part of, would have wanted to be part of an independent Ireland, and there's Protestants who would have wanted to be part of the United Kingdom. Both are left on the wrong side of the border, and that's crucial. There's disappointment, always. It always entails disappointment. It doesn't match in Northern Ireland the maximalist expectations of nationalists or the expectations of nationalists who want an all-Ireland republic or a state. And the expectations of unionists are not quite met as well. We should acknowledge that as well. These are sensitive issues. Many unionists, at least unionists as it was in the beginning of the century, it was a different unionism. And Southern unionists were left out of the picture. Unionists in Cavan are left out of the picture, Monaghan and other places. So it's a sensitive issue for nationalists and for unionists. It's not one that you can easily celebrate, and that's important. And for that reason, I would like to say that I suggest that commemorative initiatives are inevitably punctured by this kind of ambiguity, by controversy. In other words, this is an event which is less suitable for a celebration of a collective memory. I don't even believe in this term collective memory, because I think memory is always multi-layered and contested. But often people think commemoration brings people together. It doesn't. It induces awkward responses that tend to lead towards avoidance. And so whenever there's external pressures, whenever somebody comes up with this initiative of let's commemorate this event through a celebration, there's reluctance, there's inhibition. You have to think about that. And the result of that, in the terms of what I spoke about before, is a history of embarrassed non-commemorating. And that, I would like to suggest, is behind why the government of Northern Ireland for many years refrained from commemorating partition. Whenever it was done there, it was done half-heartedly at different times, different initiatives. And I think part of the notion is also not to provoke the nationalist minority. This was seen as a provocation. So it can't simply be done as state commemorations. And of course, this creates an irony in a way. Because if we look at the people who are dealing with partition and remembering it all the time, it's nationalists. If we do, for example, a newspaper troll, and we look at people marking commemoration every year, we'll find around Easter, interestingly enough, around the markings of the Easter Rising, nationalists time and time again will write articles about partition. It's the nationalists who are doing negative commemoration, if you wish, of partition. By denouncing partition, they're keeping it all the time, the debate going on. And I'll lead towards that and show how it leads to interesting kind of directions. And of course, this whole issue of throughout history, what date do we commemorate? I won't go into that again, but to remind you, there's many different dates that we commemorated. Partition is not an event, it's a process. It doesn't become an iconic date in history, not for nationalist history, not for unionist history. It's not like 1916. It's not the Easter Rising. It's not the Somme, both of which are commemorated extensively. Even though we could arguably make the case that partition is a much more significant event than the Easter Rising and then the Somme in the history of Northern Ireland and the history of Ireland. And yet it's not marked in the same way. We should, of course, be careful when I say marked, because commemoration is not about celebration, it's about contemplating events. And so the result is what I've called, in a different context, in a different book about Northern Ireland and Ulster, the result is forgetful remembrance, an ambiguous, embarrassed remembrance. Now I'm going to quickly run over for the last couple of minutes, because I'm really kind of almost out of time, and say a few words more generally about partitioned memory. When there's a partition, it's not only about creating separate and divided political entities, it also creates separate memory regimes. These separate memory regimes are not completely independent. They're tied in with each other. They compete against each other. And these are multi-layered memory regimes. What do I mean, for example? Let's remember that partition, first of all, is the partition of Ulster. The province of Ulster, sometimes synonymously mentioned in relation to Northern Ireland, but of course the province of Ulster is larger than Northern Ireland. 9 counties, 6 counties. So Ulster is partitioned. And this creates different memory regimes, because I would argue historically that there was a memory of Ulster before that, a wider memory culture within Ulster before that, which was split. Partition narrowed and congealed unionist memory. Unionist memory was also a much wider form of remembrance throughout the 19th century. In the late 19th century, around the debate over Home Rule, the first Home Rule crisis, the second Home Rule crisis, the third Home Rule crisis, it congeals and narrows itself. So it changes unionist memory culture. It challenged nationalist memory. Nationalist memory, which was always about an all-Ireland notion, had to be challenged about the split which is there. And it causes splits within different types of nationalist memories. There's a different Northern Irish nationalist memory to a Southern Irish memory. It left this conundrum and this problem of many people not identifying with the official memory of the Northern Ireland state. States use memory and commemoration, they harness it as a force to produce solidarity with the state. And yet partition is problematic. It creates these different memory regimes in Northern Ireland and in the Free State and later in the Republic of Ireland. And it creates these controversies. And in general, I think, more generally, I think partition affected the memory culture in Ulster, in Northern Ireland. It's a heavily contested memory culture. It enforces what was there anyway before that of the dynamics of reticence, of not speaking in public about problematic issues, to be cautious when you talk about these issues, that these are volatile issues. This is an exclusive memory, and it's a memory of exclusion. There's a Northern Ireland official memory, which is a unionist memory, up until 1998 and the Good Friday Agreement. And this is versus, and that's the official memory of Northern Ireland. And there's a Northern nationalist memory, which is often unofficial, partly illegal, underground memory, and they're in constant contestation. So there's a disruptive memory culture within Northern Ireland. And this is a problematic memory culture, which, like I say, is not conducive of collective and inclusive commemoration. However, and this is the point that I'd like to end with, and I'll show one more slide if I may. This controversy, this ambiguity of partition is also what keeps memory alive. It keeps it alive in an ambiguous, contested form, but people can't forget about partition. And I think that's the key point here. It's not about forgetting. It's not about amnesia. It's not about saying this is too problematic, we just don't want to discuss it. It's always there, but it's not quite there on the public stage. And this is the arena which I think is interesting. So if you allow me once again to share my screen with you, and let's hope I get this right. Do you see a white screen there, everybody? So the last slide I wanted to leave you with, just not because we have to end with some controversy, is the picture of President Michael D. Higgins, the President of the Republic of Ireland. And in this moment where he decides, opts out of taking part of, or not accepting the invitation for the service of reflection and hope organized by the churches. And he declines this invitation. A lot has been written about that, and it caused a huge amount of controversy. Now, I think this is an interesting moment, and maybe I should stay out of it. It's a hugely controversial subject, but I do have something to maybe perhaps say about this, just to end on a provocative note. President Higgins is extremely aware about issues of commemoration. On purpose, the slide that I chose here is him on the background of his seminar series, Machnamh 100, where it's a whole seminar series of historians and academics and people discussing the implications of commemoration. And then he decides not to take part in this event. And this was a cause of debate. I would argue that his not participating in the event, paradoxically, was an act of memory. By not participating in this event, he called much more attention to these issues. Much more has been written about his non-presence at this event, which means he was actually present at the event. He's an absence, he's a presence of absence, right? He's there the whole time. This is symbolic of the whole memory dynamics of partition. He was at this event even though he wasn't at the event because everybody was talking about it. He's much more remembered than the politicians who did attend the event. It's much more remembered by these measured statements which were made and issued officially by different parties. So in a way, not attending the event is a form of commemoration in itself. And that's the thought that I thought I'd leave you with, and hopefully we can have a wee bit of discussion in the little time we have left. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Guy. That was hugely impressive as ever. There are a couple of questions have come through in the chat function, both of them very detailed. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold my breath and I'm going to ask Dominic Bryan, Dominic, could you unmute yourself and perhaps ask your question? And hopefully that'll set the tone then for the remainder of the questions.
Yeah, Guy, thank you very much. Always interesting, always challenging. I'd love to find a subject somewhere in the world which we can ask you to speak on where you don't make it interesting. And I think you put your finger on it when you talk about the ambiguity that this must leave for Unionists, and it made me think about. It's easy now to look back and see why Unionists would argue for a success of Northern Ireland, but of course at the time they're leaving Unionists behind, they're leaving Protestants behind, they're dividing Ulster, they're doing all sorts of things which sort of reek of failure at the time and make celebrating or commemorating very difficult. I just wonder if you've any thought on how you can evidence that. I mean, when we talk about forgetting, we're talking about stuff that's missing. And we tend in research, both historical and social science, to look at the stuff that's there. I wonder how easy it is to evidence, if you like, your very reasoned hypothesis, which I think we might think is right. What sort of evidence, if we were sending out a research student to look for it, what sort of evidence do you think would be looking for?
All right. Well, that's exactly the kind of work that I do. If there's anything that I try to challenge within memory studies and historical studies in Ireland and beyond, it's the notion of thinking of forgetting as a void, of thinking of forgetting as pressing the delete button, of forgetting as something that's not there. It's not that that doesn't happen. That happens all the time. I would argue that we forget most of what happens in history. Let's not kid ourselves. We think we remember most and we forget the exceptions. That's not true. In any given day, we experience so many events that we will not remember. We'll remember very little. Memory is the exception. However, when we talk about forgetting, this is the interesting point for me. When we talk about something being forgotten, that means it hasn't been completely deleted. It's there under the surface, right? If it had been forgotten, we wouldn't be talking about it. Had partition been forgotten, the whole series of events at the Linen Hall Library would not have been happening. Poor Jason would be out of business for the moment and be working on his PhD on a different topic, right? But it doesn't work like that. The notion is it's there all the time. This is why I have described forgetting as a form of kind of dialectics with remembrance. That's why the title of a book that I wrote on a different subject was called Forgetful Remembrance. Forgetting is actually a form of remembering. It's not about public remembering. It's about this discomfort and muted remembrance. It's about making certain provocations and people staying away from it. So it's negative forms of remembrance, it's various muted forms, it's about the public and the private. And once you go searching for these, you find them everywhere because people's inhibitions appear in different areas. They appear in private discussions, but they also appear in various comments. It often appears in criticism saying this shouldn't be done. The moment something flares out, when a student wants to go and find debates, always find these affairs, always find the controversies, always find the moments when issues are banned and find the debates and the minutes behind that. That's the interesting moment. And so when people gather around, they have to determine things which don't work. Discomfort can be found everywhere, and that work is waiting to be done. It's always about this moment that we have to move beyond looking for the keys that fell under the spotlight, right? It's the old allegory, isn't it, of the drunk fellow who came out of the pub and he's looking for his keys and he's looking under the spotlight, under the kind of the lamp, and the policeman goes up to him and says, "Did you drop it there?" He says, "No, but the light is over here, so I'm looking over here." But it's not there. It's always in the big dark outside that we have to go and fumble around and look for it. So that would be my answer briefly.
Thanks, Guy. Thanks, Dominic. Guy, there's some praise coming through for your talk here. Another brilliant and enlightened lecture says, in fact, I'm not going to name him because he does go on to suggest that you should become the first minister of Northern Ireland. So if your position in Boston...
You don't know where I'm coming from here, right? Just remember this. I'm coming from Israel, Palestine, right? You know, there's plenty of other places which haven't been solved yet and won't be in the near future.
If Boston doesn't work out for you, I'm sure we could persuade you to do another gig here. But there is a question here from Eddie Malloy. Eddie, I wonder if you're still on the session. Could you unmute yourself and maybe ask your question, because it is quite detailed?
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you, Guy. Wonderful intervention there by you as ever. I'm just wondering, it sort of struck me in some ways that these narratives around remembering and forgetting seem to overlap, at least, or somehow run parallel to ideas of utopia and dystopia in terms of what is remembered, in terms of, especially in terms of the future orientation of remembering and forgetting in the properly political aspect, which you referred to Laura's work earlier, in the sense that both in this pre-memory phase, we're looking towards an imagined disaster or an imagined paradise, right? With or without partition, and also the ways in which the history of the Northern Irish state has been sort of remembered as being sort of some vague sort of idyll until violence erupted in 1969 or something terrible happened there. Or on the other hand, a sort of history of relentless oppression, and then sort of again moving perhaps provocatively to repositioning this idea of the pre-memory of partition to perhaps the post-memory. Are we in a phase of the pre-post memory of partition, if you like, or the pre-memory of reunification? And I think that sort of links into the utopian dystopian element, in that it's always these pasts not taken, right, which are also sort of haunt the present and sort of reconfigures how these things become remembered or again forgotten. So I just wonder if you have any reflections on that. Well,
Eddie, I think you phrased that very, very well yourself, and you've answered yourself in a fantastic way. But I think you're touching on a point which too many people miss when they deal with memory and forgetting. And memory and history. Let's speak about the larger topic of memory and history. It takes people like Don Bryan and political scientists to remind historians all the time that memory is about the present, the past and the present, right? And people know it's about this relationship of past and present. It's not about traveling back in time. It's about the past in our present context, and we're aware of that. What we forget, though, is the other part, the forgotten part of this equation. Memory is not only about the relation between past and present, it's always about future as well. Now, people comment on that in a poetic way, but they don't know how to deal with it. That's the question in the end you're asking, which I think Dominic would have had to continue had we continued his line, is how do we find a methodology to deal with it? And this is important. The horizon of expectations is huge. I often think that what we need to think as analytical tools are the moment of expectations and anxieties about throughout history and how they feel, and it's a history of kind of emotions and psychology. And this feeds in. So when we form our memory of an event, it's always about not only how we see the past, but how we imagine the future will look. And you're absolutely right about that. And yes, it's not about pre-post. You don't start making it too complicated. It's exactly as you say, it's the pre-memory of the unification of Ireland. And I don't want to worry anybody here. This might not happen, right? Pre-memories often don't happen. Pre-memories are people expecting how memory will develop. They're starting a memory in motion, but it might not. There's many more pre-memories that don't happen, what I'd call latent pre-memories, right? They're there and they're sitting there like a ticking time bomb, which might be diffused. But there's people's expectations, and they're already setting a memory in motion. The Nationalist Project for years has been preparing the memory of saying in the end, we told you, right? We've been expecting this all the time. And Unionist fears of that all the moment. So it keeps it alive. And all the time that feeds into how we deal with partition. And that feels in how we remember partition as well. Because it's always there, these fears. In a way, if you want, we can go back and find the same debate over the Home Rule Bill. If you look at postcards, it's remarkable. At the time of the third Home Rule Bill, there's a whole genre, which James McConnell in Newcastle showed me years ago, which was fantastic, a brilliant historian. If there's a whole genre of postcards of unionists afraid of what will happen if home rule kicks in, and how Ireland will fall and go to the dogs. And they have all these postcards of dystopian Ireland, and how Dublin will fall apart, and how everything will fall apart. And this is exactly how they imagined will happen. They were imagining this memory of an event that didn't happen, and home rule never kicked in, right? Something else happened. Or maybe it did kick in a different form. And that's how history plays tricks on us. So yes, my answer is we have to take into account all the time this horizon of expectations. And that feeds into the way we deal with commemoration, remembrance, and forgetting.
Thanks, Guy. I'm just going to give you a breather for a second, if I may. I just want to promote the next 3 events that are coming up as part of the Ireland Divided programme. And we have a panel discussion on Wednesday, the 1st of December, which is titled Young People, the Border and the Future of Northern Ireland. So it's almost sold out. It's going to be in person in the Lennon Hall Library. You can get on the website and get yourself booked for that. On the 9th of December, then we have a panel discussion about the Lennon Hall's Book of the Century. So we've been running some online polls as a quest to try and discover what the Book of the Century may be. Again, that's going to be in person at the Lennon Hall Library. You can book online. And then probably our most popular event of the whole programme is Professor Dermot Ferriter's coming up from Dublin to speak to us about his book, The Border, The Legacy of a Century of Anglo-Irish Politics. The in-person element of that event is completely sold out, oversold in fact, but if you do go on the website, you can register for a Zoom link to join us for a live stream. Now, I'm noticing one more notification in the chat function here. And it's just a thank you very much. So there are no more questions, and I think we've worked Guy hard enough. I thank everybody for their contributions, and I especially thank Guy for initially wanting to refuse the talk, but then coming on board with us in the end. It was a great pleasure, and I'm sure the audience will agree. Some people have been asking me, would this be recorded, etc. It has been recorded, and with Guy's kind permission, we will be able to share that with you and with anybody that you know who wasn't able to join us today for the event. So I look forward to seeing some of you in person at the Lennon Hall Library at some of our future events. So thank you again very, very much.
Thank you very much.